Welcome to Leadership Medina County's Lunch and Learn featuring Elizabeth Eckford from the Little Rock Nine. She was one of 9 African American teenagers over half a century ago who provided opportunities and opened doors to those seeking equality and education around the world. This program is sponsored by Sister Circle of Medina. Enjoy the program.
Okay, 62 years ago, 9 African American students attempted to go to Central High School on September 4th, 1957. We were turned away by the Arkansas National Guard that had been called out by the governor of the state. He said that he expected violence, and if we did not show up, there would be no violence. But I thought that the National Guard were there to protect all students. I had seen them break ranks to admit white students. I made 3 attempts to cross their lines, and each time I was thwarted. When I got to the center of the school where the guards were stationed along the sidewalk, I was directed across the street where there were about 250 angry demonstrators. When I stepped out in the street, they surged forward, and they were immediately behind me. So I could not go back in the direction I had come from. I had arrived by bus, and I had walked 2 blocks to get to the school. But that area was very familiar to me, so I started walking forward, intending to get to the end of the block where there was another bus line that would take me near my home. While I was walking, people were threatening me and saying, they were tossing around racial slurs. And at one point, somebody said, "Get a rope, let's hang her." Can you hear me clearly now?
Yes.
Okay, because this is difficult. I didn't know you wanted me to talk about the whole thing. I'm not going to do a reenactment at all. I'll just talk about what I'm comfortable in talking about. Arrived at the bus stop. There were 2 middle-aged white reporters sitting there. I sat down, and they tried to comfort me. I didn't know, but many years...
Individual non-ferrous metals determine its weldability. Weldability is the measure of the ease with which a particular metal can be...
What is that?
I'm not sure what that is. So let's... if everybody could put themselves on mute.
Okay, I arrived at the bench while the people were heckling me and threatening me. And 2 reporters there tried to comfort me. When one put his arm across my shoulder, that aroused more intense hatred from the demonstrators. I had to wait. It turned out I waited a very long time for a bus, and at one point, other people came up to me. One of them was Terrence Roberts, who I had known in junior high school and senior high school. And the other person who came was L.C. Bates, who was publisher of a weekly Negro newspaper. I recognized him because he and his wife's pictures were often in their newspaper. I knew who he was, but I didn't know him, so I didn't leave with a stranger. I thought I would be safest on the bus. I heard a woman confronting the group, and when she said that she wanted her little girl to go to school with Negro boys and girls, they became more angry, and they started threatening her too. She walked over and sat with me. At one point, I became impatient, and I got up to walk across the street to the drugstore to call a cab, but they locked the door before I could get there, so I had to go back and sit down. But it looks like my picture is frozen on the screen. Is that what you're saying? Hello?
I'm here, yes.
Okay.
The video is just really far behind.
Oh, the video is far behind.
The audio is clear.
Okay, I'm going to look at myself. I'll just talk to you.
Just keep telling the story. Thank you.
One of the Terrence Roberts, who walked up to me, was one of the students who were to go to Central High School. He lived within 5 blocks of the school, and he asked me to walk away with him. I knew that he lived near the school, and that if I left with him, I would still have to walk home about 23 blocks by myself. And I didn't leave with Terrence because I thought that if I were out on the road by myself, where there were fewer witnesses, it might be more dangerous for me. So I continued waiting for the bus, and it finally did come. When the bus came, I got on the bus, and this white woman who had been confronting the demonstrators got on the bus with me. 2 teenage boys tried to get on the bus, and she kicked them back. The driver slammed the door and drove quickly away from there. Within about 4 or 5 blocks,
Carrie.
I was able to convince Mrs. Lorge that I would be all right, that I was going to see my mother, and I didn't need any more of her help. So
Thank you.
I rode the bus for at least 25 to 30 minutes before I got to the place where my mother worked. And I had to walk a few blocks to reach the Arkansas School for the Negro Deaf and Blind, where my mother worked in the laundry. When I walked into the building, they told me that my mother was downstairs. When I went to the laundry room, her back was to me. But, when you know someone very well, you can guess what they're thinking from their body attitude. And then I knew that my mother had been praying and that she was worried. My mother was overly protective, so this had been quite an ordeal for her. Some radio reporters said that I had been injured, and so my mother was worried about that. And we talked for a while, and subsequently I walked home from there. The distance was about 5 blocks. And when I got to my house, a neighbor told me that my father was driving, trying to find me. It wasn't long that he got home. He had heard what had happened. I didn't know anything about a plan for a group of students to be accompanied by ministers in going to Central High. Terrence didn't know anything about this either, so that's why he came by himself. Later, I saw Minnie Jean Brown, who had been my neighbor during 1 year of elementary school, and she said she was walking toward Central, and she encountered her minister and another minister, and they asked her to join them and that they would escort her to Central. So while the demonstrators were heckling me, others approached the National Guardsmen as a group, and they were turned away, so that none of us was able to go to school that day. Later that evening, my father took me to where the state president of the NACP lived, we turned to the NAACP for legal help in getting into school. There was an uncertainty of when we would go to school and where we would go to school. For 17 days, we studied together, and we had copies of our textbooks, so we tried to keep up with our classes as best we could. Do you want to ask a question now?
Certainly. We had a lot of questions
on September
that were sent to us in advance, and here's one. Your experience was a result of desegregation mandated by Brown versus the Board of Education. Why did you attend Central State University?
Was because people had been taught to hate, because of their beliefs in white supremacy. They objected to us going to their school. Central was not the first school in Arkansas to be desegregated. 4 other schools in small communities had been desegregated, and those were places where the school districts had to pay for the transportation of Negro students to larger towns where there were high schools that they could go to. In many parts of Arkansas, education stopped at the 8th grade. In these towns, there were high schools for white students, but not for Negro students. So, because of the economic burden, 4 school districts decided to desegregate early, voluntarily.
Why did you decide to attend Central University, a historically black college and university?
I had gone to a very, very prestigious and very expensive college located in Galesburg, Illinois, Knox College. I could not afford to continue to go there, so I had to find another school. And at Knox, there were 9 Negro students. There were some foreign students, but the majority of students were whites from Illinois and other places in the Midwest. I went to Central State because I knew that I would be accepted there. I was very shy, but I didn't expect to encounter hatred. Do you have other questions?
What was it like moving back to your hometown after you had lived around the country?
My mother was still overly protective, and she closely monitored everything that we did, so that in the years that I was away, when I would come home on vacation, I would keep my bag packed, ready to go again. Because my father worked for the railroad, I was able to travel on train passes where I only had to pay a penny per mile. So because of that, I had moved around a lot of places, and I had not felt at home in those other places, even though there was some tranquility. I still did not feel at home. I was not settled for a very long time, for many years.
How has being afforded an education influenced your life?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said.
How has being afforded an education influenced your life?
Well, I had grown up with my grandfather telling me all the time, Elizabeth, when you go to college. So I grew up with the assumption that I would go to college, but I knew that my parents, even though both worked 2 jobs, they could not afford to pay tuition for myself and my older sister. So I knew that I needed scholarships in order to be able to go to school. And I wanted to go to Central High because I felt that that was the best education that I could get there in the area that would better prepare me for college.
If you could go back in time, would you tell your 15-year-old self to do it again?
If I knew what we would have to endure, see, within school, the first day we went into school, we went into a side entrance, and the crowd was at the opposite end of that 2-block area. So it took about an hour and a half before the students in the school and the crowd outside became aware that we were in school. When they became aware, the police who had set up barricades were not able to control the crowd. So we were gathered in the principal's office, and the police chief told us that he would have to that we would have to leave school for our own safety because they couldn't hold back the crowd. So we went to the ground floor where there were cars in the building. They were unmarked police cars. The drivers were in civilian clothes. The chief of police told us to stay down so we would not be seen. He told the drivers to drive fast and not stop for anything. So that's how we were able to safely leave there. On that day, people around the world saw some very ugly images of some reality in America. One reporter was photographed as a series of pictures where a Negro reporter was being beaten, choked, kicked, knocked down by members of what then was a mob, about 1,000 people. When these images were shown around the world, President Eisenhower said that mob rule could not prevail. He sent 1,000 paratroopers from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to Little Rock. And when they got here, they dispersed the crowd in all directions. There were soldiers walking the roof of the school. There were soldiers in the perimeter of the school, and there were soldiers in the streets with bayonets affixed to their rifles, directing people to leave. On that first day, the television and newspaper images showed soldiers as the Army was at that time, so that there were Negro soldiers among the paratroopers. But that was the only time we saw them, because General Edmund Walker, who was in charge of all troops, sent the Negro troops to Camp Robinson so that white people would not have to take orders from Negro soldiers. And he also was in charge of each of us was assigned a soldier guard in school. So when we went back to school on September 25th, we were surrounded by soldiers, and they marched us up the steps to Central High. On our Congressional Gold medals, there are images of students surrounded by soldiers going up those steps at Central High. To this day, I consider the 101st Airborne Division as our heroes because it was the soldiers who allowed us to go to school. But when we got inside the school, the principal told us that we were to report incidences to the vice principals, but he said that he wouldn't do anything about them if what we said was not verified by teachers. And teachers were not paying attention to what was going on in the hallways. The soldiers followed us in the hallways. They did not go into the gym or any classes. But in some classes, people said hateful things. Teachers didn't seem to hear it. Whatever the students did, teachers didn't seem to see it. So throughout the school year, we were knocked about every day. There was a difference, though. Among the 9 of us was Thelma Mothershed, who had a hole in her heart. She had missed some years of elementary school because she was too frail to go to school. Thelma went to school at Central every day, even though every morning her mother would tell her that she didn't have to go back to that big school. Part of the reason that we continued to try to hold on was that we didn't want to leave Thelma behind. Another reason we continued to go to school, even though after a while we knew things were not going to change and that we had no real protection. General Walker had ordered the soldiers to walk so many paces behind us that they could not intervene in the attacks on us. If they wanted to, they could report what they had seen. So it was a very, very difficult year. It was hard to go back to school every day. But initially we started out with our own individual objectives, but it didn't take long for us to realize that a lot of people were depending on us. And we had seen before in North Little Rock an attempt to desegregate a school that was ended in one day. So whether or not desegregation would proceed, we felt depended on us trying to stay there. And one of us was expelled for retaliating, and so the 9 became 8.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the retaliation?
Yes. There were some things that happened every day. You just didn't know when. We were body slammed against the wall lockers every day. In most times I didn't turn around to see who was attacking me. I had been hit from the front, and I walked in the hallways with my binder close to my chest, trying to protect myself. But at one point I realized we had a lot of straight pins at home because my sister and I sewed. So I took the straight pins and pressed them along the edge of my binder and bent them so that they were not immediately noticeable. One time, a girl told the vice principal that I had scratched her. That was the last time anybody hit me from the front. Jefferson Thomas said that he walked fast and he walked close to the wall lockers with his shoulder brushing the wall lockers as he passed through the hallways. He said he understood physics and that being closer to the wall lockers lessened the impact of being slammed against them. Carlotta Walls was very athletic. She walked very fast. She said that if somebody was trying to hit her, they were going to have to work for it. She found out many decades later that they had to change her guard every week because she wore them out. Another thing Carlotta said is that she learned, she recognized body language, so that helped her to recognize where danger was and who was going to be a problem. Gloria Ray said that she didn't go into the bathroom at school through most of the year because she didn't want flaming toilet paper coming into the stall where she was. But mostly we had no protection. Occasionally, soldiers would intervene when we were attacked. In early October, the paratroopers were removed from the school, and our protectors became the members of the all-white Arkansas National Guard. Some of them didn't make any effort to protect us. One time, I grabbed a person who was next to me when I was struck the hallway lockers, and she said that she had been shoved against me, and I could tell by her reaction that she was not one of those people who were organized to assault us and batter us every day. But that was the only time I faced someone who had hit me. Do you have any other questions?
I have another question for you. Do you think we're succeeding at achieving equality in schools now?
Segregation exists everywhere. There's in-school segregation. I remember during the 1980s hearing about Rockford, Illinois, where all of the Negro students were placed in special education without any evaluation. One woman who became a school teacher said that her mother taught her at home every day. In many places, there is not equality of access to the entire curriculum, and that is a problem in many, many places. It has been a problem here. We endured desegregation. Integration was a long time in coming after many, many court challenges.
For students today, what is the message you want them to remember about the Little Rock Nine?
Well, I tell them about two students who welcomed me every day, and they were in the last class. Even though I was a shy person, I looked forward to going to the speech class every day because that was the only place where people spoke to me kindly, and nobody in the class used racist language against me. And there was a girl who talked to me every day and a boy every day from the first time I was in the class till the end, up to the end of the school year. The boy had had contact with others among the nine, at one time he sat down in the lunchroom at the table with Jefferson Thomas. For that gesture, his fellow students said that he was a traitor to the white race. He said that by graduation time, he only had one friend left. His family received those hateful late-night threatening phone calls, as we did. But I didn't know what had happened to them. I was reunited with him 36 years later when we went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and we met some of the people who had been our soldier guards, and they were retired in that area. So we met 5 of the people who had been soldiers there. And that's when I learned that the girl, Ann Williams, didn't live in the city, that she lived on a dairy farm outside the city, that her father drove her to school every day, and that her household had armed guards at night. And I learned what had happened to Ken Reinhardt, his isolation, and people calling him a traitor. And he said that in the gym, a boy knocked him down. The coach saw it and did nothing. So it was a very, very difficult year. The only one of us was a senior, that was Ernest Green. He graduated in May, along with other seniors. I saw a picture of him with Ken Reinhardt standing near him, and other people in the background, obviously talking about them. During Ernest's graduation, people applauded the graduates. But when Ernest received his diploma, the only people who applauded were his family members and Martin Luther King, who sat with his family.
One of our participants wants to know if you still keep in touch with the others from the Little Rock Nine.
There have been occasions when we've been together, when we've been invited places for award ceremonies. And so for some of those, I have seen them. But I don't go to every place that I'm invited because I felt that a lot of that really had nothing to do with us, that we were invited because they thought that other people would be drawn to that and support their efforts. These were mostly charities, good causes, but they really had nothing to do with us. In our senior years, we received our most prestigious awards, like the Apollo 11 astronauts, Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, and Mother Teresa. We have received the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Award, which was not a fundraiser, the Congressional Gold Medal in a White House ceremony, an award from Marquette University called the Pierre Marquette Award for Education. We have received a lot of awards, but those are the most prestigious awards. Most of them came in our senior years, and we have the NAACP Spingarn Award, their highest medal. We received that summer of 1958.
I remember when I visited the museum that they talked about the fact that you made that dress that you wore on the first day that you went to Central High. Can you tell us a little bit about that dress?
Yes, it looks like a dress, but it was actually a skirt and a blouse. My sister made most of the blouse, and I hand embroidered the buttonholes. Buttonholes were hand worked back then. They were not buttonhole machines and home sewing. I remember that we added navy blue and white gingham to the border of the skirt because we ran out of white fabric. So that's why there's that gingham border, white border on the skirt. I wore that the first day, but I never wore that again. I might have worn the blouse because it was a plain camp shirt, but I remember putting that outfit in the attic and not seeing it again. And I bought my parents' house in late 1977, and I had all the stuff that had been stored in the attic discarded because by then most of the stuff had decayed, had rotted. So I don't have that outfit. I didn't even know that people would ask me about it years later.
How did you mentally prepare yourself for such a challenging event in your young life?
Well, first of all, I thought that I would hear some hateful things from some of the students, but I thought that after they got to know me, that I would be accepted. And violence in school was atypical in the 1950s. The superintendent, in making the announcement that he would choose the students who would go to Central, about 200 signed up, and he chose 17. When their names were published in the newspaper, their parents received economic retaliation, so the numbers got smaller. Another reason that the numbers got smaller, the superintendent at one point announced that those chosen could not participate in any extracurricular activity at school. This was not a barrier for me because my mother didn't allow us to participate in after-school activities. She wanted all of her children home with her in the evening and at night. My father worked late nights at the train station. When I was going to Central, we did not have any police protection. My sister remembers that the FBI were in the woods behind our house one night, but they didn't find anything. I lived on a street that dead-ended at the end of my block, and it was bordered by an old white development that had been built at one time. But in much of my neighborhood, there were clusters of one ethnic group right next to another ethnic group. There were not physical barriers such as railroad tracks or down in the holler or across the pond. And there were not things like that separating ethnic groups. In many parts of Little Rock, there was a mixture of people throughout the city, except in the upper income section of Little Rock. In planning for desegregation, the school district built 2 new schools. They built a senior high school called Horace Mann for us in the eastern industrial section of Little Rock, where there was a very small population, and they built Hall High School on the western edge of Little Rock, and it was so that children and families of the local gentry would not have to endure desegregation. And so part of the resentment of some whites was that they felt that desegregation was something imposed on everybody else except the leaders of the community.
What do you wish that the leaders of the community would have done to make the desegregation easier in your community? What could have leaders done?
Well, the superintendent had visited civic groups like the Civitans, the Kiwanis, the Chamber of Commerce, and explained the plan, what they planned. They planned limited token desegregation. They felt like if there were a few others in the school, that could be considered desegregation. Their plan, according to their plan at that time, it would have taken at least 6 years to desegregate all levels of schools. I'm sorry, I forgot what your question was. I was
asking, what do you wish leaders would have done? How could have leaders stepped up to make a difference for the desegregation?
The usual leadership of the business community was silent. They were not, their voices were not heard, and that was unusual. The only voices that were heard were the ministers and lawyers who were leading the White Citizens Council. The White Citizens Council attracted more white people because it did not have the violent reputation of the Ku Klux Klan. But the leadership didn't speak up at all. And it was not until after the end of school, when 44 teachers and administrators were fired because it was thought that they were sympathetic to desegregation. Some of those people had no connection to Central High School at all. And this made some people in the business community act. They organized a group called Stop This Outrageous Purge, because teachers and administrators were respected members of the community back then. So that this was the first time that businessmen became involved. And after all high schools in Little Rock were closed, some white women organized. There were only about 10 of them at first, but gradually their membership became larger, and they worked to lobby the legislature. They worked to point out the cost of Little Rock's reputation. They worked to reopen the schools, even though the schools would be reopened on a desegregated basis. No new industry moved into Little Rock after the schools were closed. No new industry moved here for 10 years. And so that is one reason that the business people started speaking out.
I have a question from one of our listeners asking, what can the leaders of today do to help with the problem of economic segregation? What can the average person do?
A lot of the housing patterns are established by zoning regulations, custom, and intentional redlining by real estate people. Redlining means that some financial institutions decide not to finance prospective homeowners if they were going to buy in an area that had been mostly white. See, no longer can people have restricted deeds where they promise not to sell their houses to people of another ethnic group. But a lot of desegregation remains. A lot of housing is segregated due to efforts by state government and local government. And so the state of Arkansas has been party to the suits that have proceeded over these years, as well as surrounding school districts and the Little Rock School District, because changes have been very, very slow to come. Very, very slow.
Thinking back on the schools, can you describe to our listeners the difference between the schools that you were able to go to versus Central High, the amenities, the kind of education and learning opportunities, and the differences between the two?
Central High had an excellent academic reputation. Then and now, some of the most competitive colleges in the United States recruit from Central High. They had a more extensive curriculum in white schools than there was in schools for Negroes. This pattern prevailed in most places, not just in the South, but in most places. We received the discarded books from the white schools. Carlotta said that in junior high there would be 4 people standing around waiting their turn to look through the microscope in a lab. There were some courses that were taught at Central that were not taught at the schools that were open to us. I had not been able to take a foreign language even up through the 10th grade because there were not enough teachers for additional students who wanted to take those language courses. So there were differences in curriculum, the physical plan of a school, and laboratories. There were many, many differences because generally in a lot of places school districts did not spend as much money on education for Negro students as they did for whites. I saw a 1948 picture in Life magazine of a crowded one-room schoolhouse in West Memphis, Arkansas, where it was where the little ones were sitting on the laps of the bigger kids. So that was true in many, many places.
Well, I want to be cognizant of your time today, Ms. Eckford, and just wanted to ask, is there anything else that you would like to let our leadership Medina County folks know, or any message that you have for them to inspire them as leaders and in their future? As you know, we're up here in Ohio, and just any kind of words of wisdom for us as we close would be wonderful.
All right. One thing I insist on is recognition that every voice in the community is important. If you are silent, then somebody else is speaking for you. And in schools, there's a lot of harassment going on. If you see somebody being harassed, don't just walk by, because when people just walked by me, I thought that they were thinking that I was getting what I deserved. If you reach out to support someone who's being bullied, it could help them live another day. That's not an exaggeration. That's true. So, if you see something, say something. That's my message. That's more important to me than anything else that I could say.
Well, thank you so much. Tracy Ruffin wrote the following to tell you. She is with Sister Circle. She is an African-American woman here in the community that wholeheartedly supported you coming and speaking to us today. And Tracy said, I heard you say after a while you realized others were depending on you. I just wanted to say thank you for your bravery and your courage. Thank you for sharing your story. And I want to thank you also today, Ms. Eckford, on behalf of Leadership Medina County, for your participation and for coming today to share such an important and valuable story with all of us.
Thank you. And I tell young people that when you're trying to do something that's really, really hard, if it affects just you or your family, it's easier to quit. But when you realize that what you are doing has the potential to affect many, many people, that helps you hold on. And I also emphasize that we are ordinary people, but ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances sometimes can do extraordinary things.
You are an amazing woman, and thank you again. And thank you to the Park District, to our National Park District for hosting this today. I thank you, Ms. Eckford, and I also thank Sister Circle for sponsoring this. Thank you, everyone, for participating. And please check www.leadershipmedinacounty.org for future events like this. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Leadership Medina County's Lunch and Learn with Elizabeth Eckford. For more information about upcoming Leadership Medina County events, visit us at www.leadershipmedinacounty.org.